Good morning. Welcome to Preston Auditorium. My name is Carolina Sanchez, and I am the Senior Director for the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you. I don't think I've seen this room this full before, to this event on digital technologies and the new thinking about inclusive growth. This event focuses on the impact that technology adoption will have on economic growth, productivity, jobs, and inclusion. And it is the kickoff of the one-week-long Poverty and Equity Global Practice Retreat. So we are very grateful that you're here kicking this week with us. I think we've all heard a lot about the opportunities that digital technologies may generate as we move forward. But we also have heard some about the risks that they can also generate in the form of exacerbating inequalities between individuals and countries. And when we think about the opportunities and the risks, I think this raises a question about the role of the state and the role of international cooperation in shaping up the regulatory framework specifically in which the digital economy will develop so that we can maximize the opportunities and minimize the risks. And I think this is particularly pertinent when we think about industrial, trade, and redistributive policies. There's much already happening within the World Bank when it comes to the digital economy, with 2 regional initiatives in Africa and in MENA that focus on helping countries capitalize on the potential of the digital economy, and many other activities focusing on different aspects of this agenda, from the promotion of skills to investments in infrastructure to the development of digital platforms. So our hope is that today's event informs those discussions, informs the work that we are all doing, and helps us better engage with our clients so that they can realize the potential development promise of the digital technology. We had envisioned this event with a particular order that would have Professor Stiglitz opening the event with some remarks, and that would set the context for a panel discussion later on. We have been praying for strong winds that would get Professor Stiglitz early here this morning, and I guess our prayers were heard, and the winds were so strong that he's actually running a little bit late. He took off a little bit late out of New York. He's on his way. So I'm very grateful to our panelists for their flexibility, and what we're going to do is we're going to flip around the order of the event. So we'll start with a panel discussion with the 3 other panelists, and then when Professor Stiglitz comes here, he'll have an opportunity to go over his remarks and his presentation, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A with him if he makes it here not too late. So bear with us. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion either way. We have people who have a lot to say about this agenda, and again, I welcome their flexibility. Having said that, because Professor Stiglitz was expected to set the stage, I just want to share 3 sort of headline messages from what he will say later so that we set a little bit the context and we can pick up on some of those themes during the discussion. So these are some of the ideas that you'll hear about later from him. First, new technologies open up multiple new opportunities, as I just said. But there's a real risk that unless adequately regulated, the dark side, and I'm quoting here, of these developments will predominate. And when he speaks of the dark side, he has in mind things such as exacerbation of monopolistic structures, higher income inequality both across individuals and countries, tax avoidance, and employment losses. And you'll get a chance to hear more about these both in the panel and later on from Professor Stiglitz himself. New technologies could also make it more difficult for developing countries to catch up to developed countries due to, among other things, onshoring, lack of trust undermining the global trade regime, widening knowledge gaps between developed and developing economies, and misinformation and the potential that this could have on democratic systems. And then finally, he argues that in this context, there is an important role for industrial and regulatory policies to shape the direction of innovation, as well as for redistributive policies to ensure that development under the digital economy is indeed inclusive. So these are some of the themes that we'll pick up upon the discussion. And without further ado, then I would like to ask the panelists to join me on the stage. So we are very fortunate to have with us today 3 distinguished panelists. Elizabeth Mason, who is the founding director of the Stanford Poverty and Technology Lab and a senior advisor at the Stanford Center for Poverty and Inequality. Previously, she was the co-founder and CEO of Single Stop, a national anti-poverty initiative, and was named New Yorker of the Year by NY1 in the year 2015 for her groundbreaking work fighting poverty. Welcome, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. We also have Ceyla Pasarbaşoğlu, who is the Vice President of the Equitable Growth Finance and Institutions Practice Group, of which many of you are members, and was previously the Senior Director for the Finance, Competitiveness, and Innovation Global Practice. Ceyla, thank you for joining us. And then finally, we have Farid Belhad, who is the Vice President for the Middle East and Northern Africa region, and who was previously the Chief of Staff to the World Bank President, and before that, Country Director in the Middle East in charge of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. Welcome, Farid. If you can please join me on the stage, and if you can welcome the speakers, please. There are no name tags, so I think it's really up to you. Should go down one more. So we're going to start the conversation by actually giving you sort of the floor to share with us some opening thoughts on this issue of digital technologies on the one hand and what kind of development those digital technologies may promote. So I propose that we start with Ceyla, maybe we go to you, Elizabeth, and then we come back to Farid for maybe more of a regional perspective. So Ceyla, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, see such a great audience and a great panel to talk about these important issues. We had this auditorium full on February 13th, which was our inaugural Data Day, and we had a lot of good discussions about all the opportunities and risks that come with big data and use of data in our work. So that was really, if you like, a prelude to some of the discussion today, which I'm looking forward to. Because many of these issues we're all grappling with. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to a tech talk by some of the companies, I feel very old. But it's really, there are lots of optimists and there are pessimists. We will hear from one of the prominent pessimists a bit later today. But, in terms of implications of inequality, this is really critical for our work. So the key point I would like to put on the table is that many times when we talk to authorities, government officials, and so on, it's almost like it's exogenous, that these changes are coming and that they are hit with all these exponential developments. But in a sense, like with many other things, it's not exogenous really, is it? It's really a policy choice, or dare I say a political choice in terms of what this can mean, what type of rules of the game will be put in place, what type of institutions, and what type of investments will be undertaken by countries so that they can actually impact the outcome. So it becomes endogenous, if you like. So I actually would like to put on the table this whole issue of the change, the direction of technological change, and whether technologies would be human enhancing or human replacing. And that's very critical for inequality. And here there is a choice in terms of policy options and the types of regulatory, legal, and enabling conditions that countries will put in place to actually end up with one or the other outcome, optimist versus pessimist. So in terms of policy choices, in my view, there are 2 key issues. One, what is the public policy towards the general implementation of digital technologies? We can think about direct interventions through relative prices. It could be taxation, it could be subsidies. It could be public investment in certain types of apps, for example, agricultural productivity and apps that could boost agricultural productivity. Government can subsidize certain companies and or tax automation technology. So there could be direct interventions that would have implications in terms of how mobile operators or digital technology providers operate. But we usually think about rents, and we will hear more about rents when Joe Stiglitz is here. It's usually an attractive tax base because it doesn't distort behavior. But it's not straightforward, as many of you know, in most of the countries that we work in. There are issues related to tax avoiding techniques and all sorts of other cross-border issues that make it very difficult to tax rents effectively and efficiently. So the second type of interventions are more indirect interventions. Those that could have implications, for example, introducing structural policies to have a better enabling environment, increase competition, and therefore lower prices for end users. That's another kind of intervention. Or investing in complementary public goods, such as access to internet, affordable access to internet. That, in addition to issues like ID4D or addressing, information about big data, so that the providers themselves will be willingly going to remote corners of the world to provide the services. So they don't just provide services for the rich, but it makes sense because it's scalable and you can actually make money by being able to access a much larger part of the population. And these different approaches, direct versus indirect, and how we support countries, how we support the authorities that we work in our advice, in our lending, in our operations, is really critical for us to get a better handle on. Because this, we all know, and we will hear more about this during this panel, political economy and vested interests in many of the countries that we work in are going to have implications for even the best intended, well-intended policies. So we have seen in many cases direct interventions being distorted by, in the interest of existing privileged classes. So one example I would like to give you, the Universal Service Fund. This is a tax put on mobile operators, and it's supposed to provide coverage to underserved areas. And it's a large, very hefty tax. It goes to this fund. And yet it doesn't seem to work well in Africa. A lot of these funds are undispersed, and sometimes they act like a slush fund for the government, not necessarily for the purposes of reaching those that are not served. So what this means, and it would be great to discuss this with the panel and with yourselves, is what does it mean for our work going forward? Of course, it has a lot of implications for our rigorous analytical work in terms of partnering with academia, with think tanks, policymakers, those that use these, those that actually provide these services, and to really think about evidence-based policies. And the second way would be, so rigorous analysis and data collection. The second way would be by benchmarking countries. So using this information to showcase good practices and perhaps shame or to not showcase the bad ones. We have seen that this works in several of the other types of work we do. And I know that the team is working on digital doing business indicators. That's one possible indicator. But more broadly, what policies seem to work and what policies are much more inclusive in terms of technology. Third would be supporting countries to invest in public goods. That could be from anything related to affordable access to infrastructure, fintech, govtech, digital entrepreneurship, access to markets, e-commerce. We have a major project for all the continent of Africa. I think maybe Ferid will talk about it. I like calling it Digital Economy for Africa. You call it Moonshot, you're in Hafez. But at the end, it's about digital transformation for African continent. And it's critical that we provide both the lending support, but also the advice in terms of being able to provide these types of public goods for countries. Fourth would be carefully monitoring and mitigating risks, because there are huge risks. Anything from abuse of data to discrimination, the algorithms which may be, without intention discriminating against women or against youth or other types of classes that are usually excluded. Cyber risks. There are all sorts of risks that we need to AML, CFT, that we really need to understand and help support countries to mitigate. And last but not least is representing the interests of the lower income countries and developing economies at the global fora. We sit at G20, we sit at the Financial Stability Board. Many of these global fora where the richest countries participate and lower income countries do not have a seat at the table. Yet the decisions made and the regulations put in place have implications for many of them. And I think for the World Bank, it's very important to represent those interests, not for a specific country or for a firm, of course, but for the inclusive approaches for the countries as a whole. So I have a lot to say, and there's really great work in EFI that I would love to showcase, but I'll stop here and hope to discuss more as we go on.
Thank you, Jayla. Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's a great privilege, actually, to be here in front of all of you at the World Bank. I am not one of the rock star macroeconomists, much less the sort of Mick Jagger who's coming soon, and Joseph Stiglitz. So I don't ask me any of the macroeconomic questions. I'm not an economist, and I'm actually not a techie. I'm a lawyer, so no booze by training, but I've spent my life, last 3 decades of my life, actually, as an anti-poverty advocate, both in the US and abroad. And eliminating poverty, especially in its most extreme forms, is my passion, and it's what drives me every day, and I think it's probably your passion too. So I'm excited to be among so many people who are working so hard and so passionately in the field for something that I think is the most critical struggle that we have before us in humanity. The thing about technology, which is really interesting, is we don't really know, quite frankly, even at Stanford, exactly where it's going. So I think there's this sense that people see it as this magic bullet, and I actually think that there are examples where it could be transformative, but only if we figure out the right delivery mechanisms, the right micro targets, and the right context. How do we support the delivery of those technologies so that we're actually figuring out how to use them in the right way? A lot is about the infrastructure and sort of the program planning, everything from the rules and the regulations, the framework, but also some of the basic development infrastructure, right? We can't forget the basics that go into supporting the delivery of new technologies. And I think that's what Professor Stiglitz at some point will talk about. And I can't honestly disagree with the contextualization of these things, because whenever we make mistakes in the development world, and you can go back through history and look at them, it's when we forget the context, right? We do have some really exciting new things to put into that context, but we can't forget the context. Moreover, I think the risks, although I am a cheerleader, I'm not a naysayer, but I'm a cheerleader because I want to be positive, and I want you to be positive because I think that positivity enables us to grab the opportunities that are before us and really drive them forward. That does not mean that the risks are not severe, and I think they really are. But technology is not some sort of magical force that exists separate from us. We make decisions, right? We code it. So far, we're doing the coding. We're not yet at robots coding themselves. We develop the rules, or actually we should be developing the rules. And one of the biggest problems, not just in the developing world, but quite frankly in the developed world, is that we haven't yet started really to write the rules. And it's just coming up when you see GDPR and some of the things that are happening in Europe. The US is looking a little bit in the Justice Department on these things. We need to start thinking seriously about a regulatory and legal framework to manage these things. We can't just be scared of it and think of it as this like notion that we can't control. We can control it. And that's, I think, one of the main areas where the key players, such as governments that you advise and multilateral institutions, need to start opining. If we ignore these rules and creating this regulatory framework, we're in for a really, really bumpy ride. I mean, if you think, frankly, if you just look down, Pennsylvania Avenue, and you think the bumpy ride that we're having in one of the most established democracies, or what, frankly, Britain is going through with Brexit, both happened in 2016. A lot of that had to do with the manipulation and micro-targeting of data. Imagine the potential negative impact in countries that are much more fragile. So I do think it's a serious thing to take place. However, I think the long-term prospects, if we do take that contextualization and the infrastructure building seriously, are extremely promising. To get a sense of how promising, you just have to sort of step back and think, what if you had said to your great-great-grandfather or great-great-grandmother, guess what? I can connect to my friend in Indonesia in 1 second on the internet. And even though daddy's working in Dubai, we talk to him 3 times a day via video chat, and I have access to what's going on in markets around the globe, or what other farmers are doing in Asia, and how their innovations are working, essentially instantaneously. That's the change that we've had in our world in the last really 10 to 15 years. And it resets everything in a way that possibly the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press did a while ago, but I think in a much more dramatic way in scale and fashion. So all of a sudden, because of that, hundreds of millions of people who a decade ago did not have access to banking services have access to financial services on their mobile phones. Pregnant women in remote rural areas, and some of the most remote rural areas, can get ultrasounds via portable devices, and they get delivery of medicines via drones. They also get SMS text messages saying, you're in your 3rd week of pregnancy. Have you thought about this? Your child is in its first 3 months of development. Are you looking at these types of development issues? There are extraordinary opportunities in terms of just blowing open the lack of information that's always sort of hounded development in the past. And one of the things that excites me the most, quite frankly, because I used to be an education person, is that all of a sudden you have the first time in human history where millions of children who had no access to information, many of whom weren't in school, right? Or ones who were in schools where there were 300 students to a teacher who showed up twice a week, not 5 days a week. Millions of children in those types of situations have access to information, can learn how to read and write at their own pace through videos, through online and offline content, and through interactive games. So it's a brave new world, and we stand on the cusp, I believe, of doing enormous good for an enormous number of people in probably the biggest way for any time in human history. And you all, sitting in the room and at the World Bank, actually have a key role to play in this. Now, at the same time, the basic rules of development apply. I mentioned this, right? The same barriers exist. You need to access and concentrate on access to the bottom 10 to 20%. You need to work on literacy. You need clean water. But if we double down on a lot of those goals, the technologies are here, or almost here in many cases, to dramatically accelerate, and in some cases leapfrog prior progress as never before. Now, organizations such as the World Bank are absolutely critical in that regard. Actually, I would say that arguably no one organization is better situated to shepherd this revolution for good. And I'll tell you why I think this. I spent some time as a funder in some of the biggest philanthropies, multi-billion-dollar philanthropies doing major spend downs. And one of the things that was so interesting about being in that position was that I had thousands of data points coming to me all the time. I mean, I had hundreds of organizations in my portfolio. I had thousands of organizations applying within a given year for funding. I had contacts to other funders around the world and had really deep insights to what was going on with the groups that they were working with. So I had a purge, some sort of 10,000 feet up. But I also had an intimacy with a lot of what was going on in the actual work and what was working and wasn't working. And I think something's really interesting about the position of the World Bank, which is you are in all or most of these countries. You actually are on the ground, but have an ability to do the analysis. And in a time in history in which knowledge is being replicated and duplicated and disseminated more quickly than ever before, there's actually a huge strategic advantage to being an organization that can glean insight and innovations from the field, not just geographically from the field, from 180 different countries, but also from education. Is there a corollary in health? From health, can we be applying something like this to agriculture? If you all were to figure out how to manage your innovation loops, and I totally believe in evidence-based policy, but I think sometimes the traditional ways of doing evidence-based policy, like RCTs, really slow you down. Some of the new big data opportunities on policy making, actually, and quite frankly, some of very basic feedback that we can now get from two-way feedback from the field through SMS texts or surveys with actual recipients, or data satellites, seeing whether or not programs are being deployed correctly, gives you an opportunity, I think, to make much quicker assessments as to whether your expected impact is rolling out. So I think the World Bank has an opportunity to sort of be a coordinator, orchestrator, and disseminator of knowledge and innovation in a much quicker way than almost any other institution on earth. And that itself, I think, actually can give development an edge. We can talk more about that. There are 5 things I just want to talk about very quickly, and I won't go on forever. 5 principles I encourage you to think about as you think about your work around the world and you take on this challenge of digital technology for inclusive development. 1 is how might technological innovations be portable, as I just said, across geographies and/or fields? So are there advances in digital health that can have analogs in online education? Are there things going on with satellite-based agriculture improvement in East Africa that are also potentially useful for thinking about how to do slum improvement in India? 2, are there emerging technologies in the developed world that could easily be adapted to work in other contexts? Now, this is hard because the technologies haven't emerged yet, but let's say, for example, could we develop safe online recruiting sites for workers to connect workers to verify jobs and avoid things like sex and drug trafficking? 3, how can the World Bank help avoid many of the problems we've seen in the developed world? I mean, one of the advantages is it's coming out here first, and you actually have a little bit of time to see what the problems are. And we've clearly had some major problems. So the biggest 2 obvious ones that are happening in terms of the problems of the developed world are the data, what I like to call the data vampires. What's happening with big, large multinationals and how they're sucking our information out of us and commoditizing us versus us figuring out how to commoditize them. And at the same time, avoiding taxation in many ways, in ways that are, I think, very destructive for our ability to reinvest in public goods. And political misinformation campaigns, which are clearly highly dangerous and can be controlled if the regulations are put in place in advance. 4, how are we using or deploying technology with a view to overcoming basic development barriers? Are we focusing on things like gender disparity? Because that plays throughout everything, and women don't have the same access, as you know, to men, to even mobile devices. Are we focusing on using these new technologies to actually strengthen civil society through access to information, rights, and services? Are we doing things like using blockchain to create portable identities for people in situations of refugee crisis? Or, quite frankly, just so that they can do things like go to a bank and get a bank account, or do a bank account online? Or blockchain to provide titles to land? How many folks around the world have land that they don't have titles to and then doesn't allow them to move up the economic ladder? And 5, the last one that I would say is really important, it's the one on everybody's mind all the time, which is where can we leapfrog? Because clearly there are some opportunities to leapfrog and we need to grab them. I think there are really exciting examples already on the potential impact of cellular that's been used for banking and education and health information. And I think there's another one, these are just the ones that come to my mind, that allows countries to create what I'd like to envision, sort of a CompStat on poverty. I don't know if you all know what happened in New York City with Giuliani, but we had this terrible rise of crime, and they basically set up this extraordinarily complicated, very, very pinpointed data set. And they started looking at things like, oh, okay, there's a broken window here, or there's graffiti here, and they started sort of down the chain through extremely targeted interventions, deciding how to clean up the initial problems, but then also how to deploy their police forces and their public forces. Within seconds, they had data coming in constantly that could reevaluate the issues that they had in neighborhoods. I think that, interestingly enough, in the US, and I've worked a lot on big data sets for poverty, we have this problem because we have these legacy silos we can't deal with, right? So in the US, for example, we have incredible administrative data, but it is unbelievably difficult, if not honestly impossible in many cases, to figure out, all right, well, poverty is not like a one situation. It's, your health affects your education affects your housing, and all these things vice versa, right? But we can't integrate those data sets because they've been built up over 50 years in these very, very sort of structured institutions, legacy data sets they don't integrate. You all have an opportunity, I think, to create much more flexible CompStats, what I would call on poverty, where you're looking not just in silos of particular focus areas, whether it's education or health, not just within countries or geographic spaces even within countries, but using things like satellite, SMS data, regular administrative data, and building up those new data sets in a way that are extremely flexible, extremely responsive, and allow you to do things that advertisers already do so well, which is micro-target you. Like, I know you want to buy pink shoes tomorrow, so I'm going to give you 1 million advertisements for pink shoes, and you're going to buy those because if I show these to you 7 times, you're going to buy them. Well, we can use those same techniques and apply them for good. Instead of for selling goods, we can use them to actually get progress on many of our development goals. If we can micro-target and better deploy the limited resources that we have a huge possibility for a new world. So 100 years from now, when historians and economists will be looking back on this time, because I think it will be a very critical time in history given the pace of change, they'll either praise what we've done, or they'll say, you missed a lot of opportunities. And I think a large part of this is specifically up to us. Various people are alleged to have said, from sort of Voltaire to FDR to what my sons say is Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think the World Bank's power, your individual power, is your unrivaled knowledge and touch at the heartbeat of what's going on in the developed world, all across the world, across silos, across countries. And your responsibility, obviously, is then to take that knowledge, figure out how to build your own knowledge systems and innovation loops to help really guide governments in shaping and smoothing and harnessing the extraordinary opportunity we have here for breakthrough technologies to unleash and hopefully solve some of humanity's biggest problems. I really, really believe the story is yours to write. So thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Ferit, over to you to tell us a little bit more about how all of this is playing out in MENA.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I was actually looking very much forward to this panel because I thought, first of all, that I would be the only lawyer here. And second, that for a lawyer to be sitting on a panel with a Nobel Prize in economics, that's quite an interesting challenge and an interesting proposition. I'm quite disappointed that the headwinds that we've been talking about. Okay, good. So very happy to be here. Let me say a couple of things first. Being positive is not an option. The train has left the station, and there is no turning back. So the issue is not to like it or not to like it, to move ahead with it or not to move ahead with it. The issue is, how can we make the best out of it? And best out of it in the lives of the real people, those with whom we are engaging on a daily basis. The issue is, how can we manage this divide? We've been talking about digital divide for quite some time. This one is really moving at a light speed. We need to make sure that we have, enough in ourselves in terms of expertise, in terms of understanding that would allow us indeed to help the countries and the people we are supposed to be helping. I'm going to move to MENA because that's the region I know best, and that's the region I'm kind of responsible for, and where we believe that there is an interesting dynamic for innovation, and an interesting dynamic when we look at the demographics of the place. In MENA today, there is a youth bulge. It is almost unprecedented. We are looking by 2050 at around 300 million young people knocking at the doors of the job market. And this is very important. It is compelling. It is a tremendous opportunity. And these young people are tech very active. They are very active on the social media. They are extremely well endowed when it comes to understanding what's happening around them. And by the way, we saw it. When they found out that what was happening around them was not meeting their own aspiration, that people were moving way ahead of them, well, you know what? They revolted. And you know what? We had, a tremendous tectonic shift in the whole region, starting from 2010 and 11 up until today, by the way. And this, we didn't see it coming. Anyway, some of us didn't see it coming. And even those who saw it coming couldn't do much about it. So now we are in a situation where we need to make sure that we are looking ahead of whichever curve we are engaging in. So this is the first big data for us. 300 million, 2050, and we need to start yesterday. 10 million jobs a year that need to be created in the Middle East and North Africa region. For that, we need a new economic model. If we haven't succeeded in creating a job market that was active and where education and the needs of the job market were in some kind of an adequacy over the last few years or the last few decades, well, maybe you should change and look at something else, something different. And that something different may very well be this possible leapfrogging that we've been talking about, and possibly going to, beyond the immediate horizon of what we have. Frankly, when I look today at MENA, I don't think that these young people should be destined to be, on automakers' assembly lines for the foreseeable future. For two reasons. One, because I believe that they are worth more than that, a number of them anyway. And second, because those assembly lines are going to be obsolete tomorrow, because artificial intelligence and robotics are going to be taking over. So all of those jobs may be disappearing, fizzling away. We need to find a way to make sure that creativity, a new high-end type of services become part and parcel of the economic model of the youth. And I see Mahmoud leaving. I thought you'd be interested in MENA. Okay. Okay. Anyway, it also so happens that the Middle East and North Africa region is the least integrated region in the whole world. For a number of reasons, economic reasons, most of them, unfortunately, political reasons. When I visit with the countries we are working on, I was in Algeria lately, you talk to young people, they are actually trading with each other, not just within Algeria, with Morocco, with Tunisia, with other places, using new technologies. There is a way for new technologies to actually break some of those political constraints that we see today and that we are living with. There is also something else. What led to the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, is also a number of factors, related to bad governance, lack of transparency, lack of contestability. Well, new technology can bring about a new dynamic that would allow for that transparency, for that openness in the market, for people to see who is doing what to whom at any given time. And that's quite important as well. We need to also keep that very much in mind in terms of our way of looking forward. So as I said, the employment challenge for MENA will not be met and resolved by going into 20th century solutions. We need to find new ways of engaging in our business. Hence, our way of kind of transforming the engagement of the World Bank in the Middle East and North Africa. First of all, we are looking much more into the whole high-end education. You know, the Middle East and North Africa region is investing like no other in education, investing in terms of numbers. But when you look at the return on investment, it is really quite disappointing. We need to make sure that we change the curricula, we change the way education is governed and education is dispensed to these young people so that we can make sure that there is that bridge between the education sector, between what people learn. It's not just being educated, it's learning and learning to learn. This is basically what our World Development Report of a year ago was all about, learning to learn, because things are changing extremely fast. So this is something that we are very much moving forward on. Second issue is, while educating these young people, we need to take out of their mind the fact that tomorrow's jobs are going to be public sector jobs. The private sector is the key here. Whether we like it or not, there too, the train has left the station. Our countries in MENA, broadly speaking around the world, but in MENA in particular, are heavily indebted. There is no way they will continue investing public money into anything that has an economic dynamic to it. What we need to make sure of is that the private sector is very much in the driver's seat. And this is why we have moved very aggressively on what we call here, yet another one of our jargons, maximizing financing for development, the cascade approach. We make sure that, talking about algorithms, any project that comes through my office, I would first need to make sure that people would make strong rationale for why is it that particular operation is not going to be managed through the IFC or through directly the private sector. Only when I am convinced, and everybody around the table is convinced, would we put some public money behind these type of projects. Third, new technologies. And again, going back to that, we believe that that's going to be a huge driver. Now, we are not naive, and we know two things. One is that we are behind, so there is a need to really, again, leapfrog. I've been talking about a MENA 5G ambition. You know, it is out there, and we need to place our ambition as high as we can, so that we have the energy to move towards that ambition. And second, that the institutions in our countries are not solid, deep enough to weather, what I would call the aggression that would be coming from elsewhere. We need to make sure that our institutions, are able to open up so that we can have regulations that will be able to manage, to frame this new activity, and regulations that will be secure, that would be predictable enough, that would bring comfort to the investors at a high level of performance, but at the same time, not to be too constraining, too stringent, because otherwise we are killing the whole drive. I'll give you one example. In Tunisia, there was a few months ago the adoption of a Startup Act. Great, because that was a political recognition that new technologies, startups are really part and parcel of the broad economic landscape. But you go from a place where there was absolutely no regulation to a place where you are starting to overregulate. This law is overregulating an industry that should not be overregulating. Actually, we may not need laws for these kind of industries. Actually, what we would need are, would be very light, very flexible regulations that would allow the young people and the less than young people, be able to be creative, be able to put on the table, new ideas and new ways of developing business without necessarily having to seek authorization every step of the way. So we need to find in ourselves new ways of managing that kind of a regulation. And you are absolutely right. This is going to be the big challenge as we move forward. There are a few examples. In Singapore, for instance, they have the whole sandbox, where you basically constrain, a number of industries, and you have people experiment, and see whether, the type of regulation that will be put within a type of industry could actually be generalized. We can look at that. We can look at other ways of engaging there. And then, last but not least, the whole international system, the regulation at the international level. Today, who do we have around the world engaged and performing on new technologies? We have the United States, you have China, maybe Europe. Well, the issue is that we may find ourselves, because we are looking at the countries that we are trying to serve, in a place where we would be totally out of that discussion, totally out of that debate. So that's a big question mark that we should be putting on the table. Remember when WTO and its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, etc., were put together. They were put together because there was a need, and there were many actors, and those actors were in some kind of a conflict and needed a broad regulation. Today, we have more or less the same kind of dynamic, and we need to make sure that our countries are not totally overwhelmed by a new industry that would actually be, looking like predators for data and basically making the digital divide widen and widen even more. So this is something that we really need to be keeping in mind as we move forward and as we engage and as we suggest to our clients that the only way forward is new technologies. We need to make sure that we are not advising them in the wrong way. Thanks.
Thank you to all three of you for, I think, putting on the table a lot of the issues that we hope to discuss in the second hour. I have breaking news that is Professor Stiglitz has landed a few minutes ago, and we think he should be here in the next 10 to 15 minutes, which is great because that gives me a chance to ask you a couple of follow-up questions that came up as I was listening to all of you. And then what we'll probably do is have Professor Stiglitz go through his remarks, and then we'll open up the panel for questions from the floor. And I think that worked out nicely for the event overall. All three of you alluded to the role that the government has to play as the digital economy develops. Particularly paying attention to this idea of inclusion and making sure that we are leveling the playing field and not exacerbating some of the divides. So Jayla, I wanted to get back to you on that because this is sort of core to the mandate of EFI and ask you a little bit, how are we thinking about engaging with governments in this context? What needs to be done differently? What are some of the things that EFI is doing in this area?
Okay, so what I wanted, and it's a little bit of a reflection after hearing Farid. So to me, the key question is, I mentioned some of the areas that we are already working on, but from the poverty report, large proportion of the poor live in rural areas. And in many countries, we have the informal sector. 90% of the firms are in the informal sector. I see Penny here, who we have been talking about implications of digital financial services in increasing productivity of informal workers and firms. To me, the key question is how can we increase our efforts to support that segment, which is really critical in addressing poverty and inequality. Because I think the youth who are tech savvy, that's great, we should have opportunities for them and so on. But when we look at the bulk of the poor, they are illiterate, innumerate, and how do we make sure that technology is actually enhancing their productivity, their ability to participate in the economy? And that could be, in terms of digital technologies that should allow them to access market, to access transactions, access insurance. All these are very critical, and with technology, we should start rethinking a little bit some of these issues. So in terms of what we are doing in EFI, there's very innovative work going on GovTech, some of the issues that you mentioned in terms of citizen engagement, in terms of e-procurement, giving access to those that usually don't get access, much more transparency. By targeting with digital ID, we have a great group. ID4D has been really doing a great job with many partners in introducing ID for those who never had IDs before, and that's really critical to be able to access some of these services. We are also doing a lot of work on fintech and looking at how digital financial services can increase not just access to credit, because that's only part of it. Savings is critical, transactions, access to markets, and insurance. We always forget about insurance, but let's not forget, for many of the poor, they don't have insurance. They don't have access to anything if they miss a day of work. So we need to think about ways of bringing those type of services to them, which will allow them to have some contingency funding, if you like. And there was a very innovative program called CLIP. It's actually is in place in Kenya. It's for cattle farmers. And what it does is it uses a simple technology to measure grazing conditions. So insurance providers who wouldn't be able to provide services at affordable prices are able to do so now through this World Bank assisted program, where the grazing conditions are measured, and when they are below a certain trigger point, it disperses automatically. What that means is those farmers who are really subsistence farmers and depend on the well-being of their livestock to be able to have earnings, government can plan ahead, and instead of paying for dead animals after the effect, they can pay prior and avoid some of these, or at least minimize some of these outcomes by either bringing feed early on, or moving them, or taking action. So insurance, the way we think about insurance as coming after the fact and paying for losses, can be turned around using technology by actually trying to minimize bad outcomes. So there are many different other examples that we have been working on, but to me, the critical question in my mind is, in this very fast-moving technological space, how do we disseminate information, exactly like you said? And given our silos at the bank, we have our GPs, agriculture, climate, finance. How do we make sure that we learn from each other? And we have this whole program, digital transformation. Ed has been working very hard on to bring us all together and talk about these issues. But to me, this is the critical point, because I am sure in different, and I know it because there's a lot going on in the units that I work with very closely. In different corners of the world, incredible work is going on. But I don't know how we can leverage each other and scale this up so that it's not a nice project here and there, but really makes an impact.
Thank you. Maybe let me pick on that, and Elizabeth, go to you, because the Poverty and Technology Lab that you lead is very sort of solution-oriented, right? The idea is to figure out what works, what doesn't. So maybe ask you to reflect on something that works, something that you know has worked, and walk us through it, but walk us through it in the spirit of really reflecting on why did it work? What were the kinds of things that we needed to think about to make it actually work and to ensure that it was successful in delivering those results to those that needed it most. So your choice, but if you can sort of reflect on that particular issue, that would be useful. Thanks.
Sure. It's interesting, actually. I started the lab. It's a fascinating story. I started it because I was in Silicon Valley and landed at Stanford at the Center on Poverty, where I'm on the board and I'm an anti-poverty expert. And sitting there, thought, wow, this is Stanford, this is Silicon Valley. I wonder what is happening around the issues of applying all this technological revolution to the issues that matter most to human society. What's happening? So I started to look around, and ironically, I found a lot of interesting examples in startups, or sort of, people doing different work, but disconnected in all corners of the world. But really, nobody even talking about a field of the tech and digital revolution and how it could be used to address issues of homelessness or health, poverty, education, government infrastructure, all the things that actually should matter to us most. I mean, there's so much going on about how I can get the best burrito in 10 seconds, right? Like, why aren't we talking about how I can get health care, right? And so that's why I started the lab. So while we're focused on two things. One is, actually incubating and trying to find some solutions where they're missing. But I don't think, even it being Stanford, that Stanford is the center of the universe, or it's going to be the place that's going to solve all the problems. So actually, one of the things we're most interested in is actually promoting and encouraging this notion of, given the fact that we are living through one of the greatest changes in human history right now, how are we using those changes, harnessing those changes to affect the issues that affect us most as human beings in ways that we could potentially solve them for the first time in human history. We have never, ever been a time in history where we've talked about potentially ending extreme poverty. That's just never been even talked about before because it was so far away. And now we are. And it is possible, not easy, but possible. So I think that I was just reflecting on some of the things you were talking about, the World Bank. I don't know the World Bank well. I've done projects with it over the last 20 years, but I don't know it intimately. My sense is that thinking that the internal issue for making it work really well, and I say this with a lot of deference and respect because it's just my gut, is that figuring out how to be a knowledge management and innovation organization within what I would imagine is a fairly constricted and fairly sort of structured organization that's dispersed both geographically but also in subject matter expertise, figuring out how to layer on a serious endeavor on knowledge management and innovation loop and dissemination will be key, because you do actually clearly have the data and the information that's going to be bubbling up in all these different ways, but I don't know if you all are yet structured in a way to utilize that for the power that it really could be. And the power it could be is extraordinary, because if you think about it, there's no single government on earth, and there's certainly no company on earth, and there's certainly no sector on earth where people are organized to figure out how to harness the knowledge as quickly as it's coming out. So it actually becomes a strategic advantage versus a disadvantage if the World Bank is able to figure it out. And one of the reasons, obviously, on a much smaller scale, to go back to Stanford, I did this at Stanford, is I thought, well, since we're in Silicon Valley, and since we have a center on poverty, isn't this a place where we should have our ear to the ground and start trying to encourage the growth of the field that really looks at this, but also trying to capture some of those innovations. What I think works in general is making sure you know your target and really honing down on your target audience. I believe that in a lot of the process that's been going on in terms of iterative development, the IDEO-like process in terms of planning, I do think that the most you can sort of plan, not in a room locked up and then sort of disseminate your project, but plan and then work with people in the field to develop prototypes. And in the field, I mean not just field workers from the World Bank, but like people who are actually going to experience the end user, and rapidly developing prototypes and moving them out. And that's one of the things that the tech world's done so well, is figuring out how to rapidly prototype and move out and then adjust. I think is something that can actually have huge implications for some of the tech programming and the development programming that you do. And the last thing I would just say in general about, this entire theme is, I think what it's about is how you put those who've been previously essentially invisible on the map. I mean, that's what the whole thing is, right? So if that means 5G, which I think is huge, right? Because then all of a sudden you can actually get smartphones, not just dumb phones, which we have in most places, right? We should be planning for dumb phones now, but you can get smartphones. If it's about getting people identity or banked or insurance, if it's about making sure that we're really looking at universal adoption policies and maybe subsidies to get those types of things out to people in ways that they can't afford it. If it's really thinking about targeting those who are illiterate and enumerate so that they can have the ability to access all these wonderful things, or very, very structured and targeted digital technology training for the youth workforce, because the reality is, sure, maybe they could work in manufacturing for the next 5 years, but really that game's gonna be over. So I think all the things we've been talking about, but it is about focusing on how do you put the indivisibles on the map, give them real identities, real opportunities, real practices that can allow for a broad-based and broadly distributed development advantage.
Thanks. I'm assuming you guys will let me know when Professor Stiglitz is here, because I'm wrapped up in the discussion, so I'll just take your cue. Faye, let me turn to you. And I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier, because as you were setting the context in MENA and some of the challenges, you talked about the private sector. And we've talked about the role of the government, how the government can and should support the development of the digital economy, creating an enabling environment, sort of the structures. But ultimately, the action is going to be in the private sector to some extent. So how should we think about that? What's the role of the private sector? And what's the interaction between the private and the public that would give us the outcome that we want, and in the context of MENA or otherwise?
When I go around the countries in MENA, meeting those young people, and again, less young people who are actually engaged in this new industry, their ask from the bank is to help them get the government, in a way, off their back. And that's the bottom line. And this is frankly what we could do through our policy engagement with government, making sure that we don't fall again, as I was mentioning earlier, into the trap of over-regulating, this is our comfort zone, put a framework and get people to work and to evolve within it. We need to make sure that we reinvent ourselves so that the government would listen to our advice, and government themselves start reinventing themselves. I would give you a couple of examples. When it comes to poverty targeting, for instance, well, I take the case of Morocco. They have imported a technique from India, kind of a unique identifier, and they have basically instilled it into their new ways of engaging with poverty and engaging with the vulnerable population there. It's good. The issue is that some people will tell you, yeah, but this is a way for the government to have total hand on absolutely every single data that is coming out of the country. It is true, but that's the way things are going. Hello, sir. I am very happy that you finally came. Yeah.
You want some water?
Yes, please.
Yes, we were all mentioning that we have a couple of lawyers here, so having you here as the Nobel Prize for economics is quite an interesting interaction that we've been having. So I'll finish with this. One, get the government off of the back of these young people, young entrepreneurs. Second, get the government to have a broader but very, very fluid, very flexible set of regulations so that startups can go and to become scale-ups, so that they can get the investors not to be just angel investors, but to have investors who actually believe in that business and believe that money put into that business can actually be a good investment. And the third point is to make sure that our whole conversation when it comes to the education system becomes a conversation that is grounded in one thing: the adequacy between the education system that we are promoting, and the government are promoting, and the industry that is evolving extremely fast. And this is where, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, learning to learn and moving very fast into our curriculum so that we are not fixed into educating people, but fixed into making people learn as they go. And the learning is not there is no end to it. It is something that we need to really to promote. So this is the way we should be engaging in each one of the countries we are engaging in. And thank you very much. And good to have you again.
Thank you. And welcome, Professor Stiglitz. We're so glad you could make it. There were moments of doubt there, but I'm glad that you're here. Given that you were running a little bit late, what we did was we flipped around the structure of the event. So we've been having a very interesting conversation for the last hour and 15 minutes. And what I propose we do is that we give the floor to you now for your remarks, and maybe we open it then after that for questions and answers with the audience, if that's okay with you. Let me, however, you need no introduction, but I'm going to try to make an attempt at introducing you to our audience anyway, before I give you the floor, and to give you a couple of extra minutes. I think you all know Professor Stiglitz, but maybe let me share a few highlights. He's currently a professor of economics at Columbia University, where he's also the chair of the Committee on Global Thought, and where he also co-founded and currently directs the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. Of course, we all know that he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in the year 2001 for his seminal work on markets and asymmetric information. But what I didn't know, and I thought was very interesting, is that he was also the lead author of the 1995 report on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which then shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Wow, that's impressive. He was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors between the years 1993 and 95, and then he chaired the council in the years 1995 to 97. And of course, some of you will remember that he was the chief economist and senior vice president here at the World Bank from the year 1997 to 2000. And that's just, sort of a few highlights of what has been a very distinguished career. So we are very honored to have you, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Is there a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Oh, is that it? Well, first, let me say, is it on? Yeah. Okay. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back at the World Bank. It was for me probably certainly one or probably the most exciting and enjoyable years of my life. It was wonderful being with a group of dedicated international civil servants who every morning woke up with a question of how they could reduce poverty and promote economic development. And I was head of DEC, so we were involved in research, and the research that was going on at the World Bank was really the cutting-edge research in development. The debates that we had about how we best promote development and reduce poverty were among the wonderful democratic debates and illustrated, I think, the virtues of democracy and openness. I know the bank is going through difficult times where some people question the value of multilateralism in development. And let me just say, I think those who question it are absolutely wrong. I think the only approach to multilateralism, to development, is through multilateralism. And the critics, particularly those coming from the American administration, I think are both unthoughtful and misguided. I hope it's a passing phenomena. I think it's very important for you not to be either distracted or discouraged by this hostility, and that your work is too important. The fight against poverty that this particular group is engaged in is too important to be detracted from by a petty, misguided, bigot, misogynist, or people that he might appoint, or try to appoint. So I just want to encourage you to continue your important work in spite of some travails you may have to face. The subject of today's talk is about the digital economy, which I'm going to talk about in a very broad way. Digital economy, new technologies, artificial intelligence, from a very, you might say, high-level perspective. And I know there's been a lot of euphoria, a lot of discussion of some of the opportunities that these new technologies offer, and I'll come to talk about some of those later, and probably talked about in the discussion I missed in access to finance and communication, access to markets, connectedness, a whole set of areas. Being an economist, economists always, call it the dismal science. So I'm going to begin with the more dismal aspects, and I think actually there are lots of things to worry about. I think if one is aware of what the problems are, one is more likely to be able to address them. So there are actually multiple concerns. For instance, will the new digital technologies make it more difficult for developing countries to close the gap between themselves and the advanced countries? The obvious thing is that the more advanced countries are moving fast forward, and the gap, to close that gap, one has to run faster. Even in the advanced countries, there's a lot of worry about joblessness and declining wages of unskilled workers. And that translates in developing countries, will lead to increased unemployment and wage and income inequality within developing countries, even as it increases opportunities for a few at the top. Will it lead to increased market power? The evidence in the United States is that the new technologies are contributing significantly to monopolization, to an increase in concentration of market power, which is a major contributor to the growing inequality in the United States, which is in turn playing a role in our political and economic malaise. Will the new technologies make it more difficult for governments to collect tax revenues? There is absolutely no doubt that they have enhanced the ability of money to move across borders and out of the places where they might make their contribution. And at the top of the tax avoiders are companies like Google and Amazon. So they've used the new digital technology, and they've used their cleverness to avoid paying taxes. And they call themselves corporations with a kind of corporate responsibility, but the first element of corporate responsibility is paying your taxes. There is increasing worries about privacy and about political manipulation. Finally, there are questions about how worried should we be about the new technologies contributing to undermining the global trade order. And as I'll say, I think we should be actually very worried. So the general perspective is that these new technologies are a double-edged sword. They open up multiple new opportunities, but there's a real risk that unless adequately regulated, the dark side will predominate with more monopolization, more inequality of income and of voice, more invasion of privacy, more tax avoidance and evasion, less tax revenues, and less secure employment. An example, if you talk to the founders of Twitter and the other people in Twitter, they'll talk about the great role that Twitter had in democratizing voice. Anybody could get on Twitter and publish what they thought. And as we know, some people do that with assiduousness, even when it's not a thought. But what we've discovered is that having something like Twitter doesn't mean everybody has equal access. Because the magnitude of the voice that one hears can be affected by how much you invest. The bots whose voices are predominant cost money. And so the voices that are heard louder are actually voices that are shaped by money. So money has turned out to undermine what was intended to be a democratizing innovation into one where money seems to matter more than anywhere else. There are large implications for developing countries, and in many ways, specific applications of some of the ideas that I've talked about. It will make it more difficult for developing countries in many ways to catch up. The obvious example, one of the things that's going on is onshoring. One of the comparative advantages that the developing countries had was low-skilled labor and unskilled labor. But the new technologies replace unskilled, low-skilled labor by robots, and have effectively decreased the price of unskilled labor. And that has meant it is possible for many of the jobs to come back onshore. There's a lack of trust undermining the global trade regime, particularly with some of the new technology, and that's leading to what has been called the splinter net. There are problems of mental health, the lack of focus that are showing up in advanced countries. I was just at Facebook for a meeting, and one of the striking things is many people in Silicon Valley do not allow their children to get on Facebook or on other social media because they know what it does to their mental state. So there are real problems of mental health, and those are more difficult, maybe more difficult for those in developing countries to manage. The consequences of undermining democracy may be worse in countries with weaker institutions. And even spreading of misinformation about development-related information may have really real consequences for developing countries. So, for instance, one of the things going around on the internet now, misinformation, is the dangers of vaccines. And when almost everybody is vaccinated, having a few people not being vaccinated, and having strong governments that say you have to be vaccinated in order to go to school is one thing. But in developing countries, it may be that it may not be so easy to combat this kind of misinformation, and the consequences for disease can be quite significant. So the fact that there's access to information has become more universal, but the gaps between the information available to advanced countries, those who access to the internet and those who don't, may increase. So there's a very general theorem, which is that new technologies expand the society's production possibilities, utility possibility schedule, but they often lead to a new equilibrium, a new market equilibrium with greater inequality. Historically, it's often taken a very long time for the adverse effects on inequality to be outweighed by the overall growth. In the beginning of the first industrial revolution, people moving into the urban centers in the UK, their life expectancy went down. The standards of living actually were worse off in many ways. So, and you know, one of the key issues now today in development is that the model of manufacturing export-led growth, the model that was used so successfully by countries of East Asia, has already been undermined. There are alternative strategies that people are thinking through, multi-pronged strategies, but they are more difficult and so far haven't proven themselves. And these problems are exacerbated by international agreements ensuring the flow of patent ranks, intellectual property ranks, to advanced countries and undermining the flow of tax revenues to developing countries. So the broad concern is that the growth of these new technologies lead to even more inequality and unemployment. Machines have long been stronger than humans, better able to do many physical jobs, better at processing large amounts of information. But what has happened in the last 5 years is that machines, artificial intelligence, actually can learn better than humans, and in many ways be more creative in humans, at least in certain narrowly defined domains. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which they can replace or outperform humans in the immediate future, and there are alternatives of thinking about intelligence assisting innovation, which would increase the productivities of large proportions of the population. But the fact is that what we know right now is that there is a real downside risk. And the fact that previous episodes, like at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, things worked out well, is no assurance that it would today, and lots of reasons to think there are major differences. So this is just a very simple graphical way of illustrating the shift in, you might call it the utility possibilities curve. Everybody could be better off with the new technology to move from E0 to the Northeast. But in fact, the market equilibrium, you move from E0 to E1, where capitalists and skilled workers may be better off, but unskilled workers actually worse off. If redistributions were costless, everybody could be made better off, but they aren't costless. And in many instances, undoing the distributive consequences is neither economically nor politically feasible, in which case it's not a surprise that there will be opposition. In fact, when markets are not working perfectly, and they never are, especially in the context of innovation, there is always the possibility that the innovation actually will be making society worse off. And we can all think of examples of innovations that have not been productive, innovations like high-frequency trading, which has not made any positive contribution and actually just wasted society's resources. So there's a very big implication of what I call the no first welfare theorem. The standard belief in markets is Adam Smith's invisible hand. Markets lead to efficient outcomes. The proofs of Arrow and DeBrew and everybody subsequent are based on a given technology, and technology is not endogenous. But there is no theorem that markets produce either the efficient level or the efficient direction of innovation. We shouldn't be having innovation that replace unskilled labor when we already have a high level of unemployment of unskilled labor. What we ought to be doing is thinking about innovations that would save the planet. But the market doesn't produce enough of that. There's too little innovation about how we can have an inclusive economy, and too much innovation, like of examples of digital addiction. And every day there's an article today in the Financial Times about how Facebook deliberately tried to get children to spend more money through addictive practices. So a lot of this very hard to find out. It's only through suits, legal recourse, that we find out a little bit of what's going on. So it's important. There's an important role for industrial and regulatory policies to shape the direction of innovation. So the critical public policy question is: are there public policies that would ensure that everyone would be better off, and will those policies emerge out of our political process? And I'm going to talk about the first of those questions. And my view is that there are policies, but to combat the adverse effects, there will be need to be a whole comprehensive set of policies. So first, to try to put it in a broad perspective, is that innovation gives rise to rents. Rents can be taxed without creating distortions, and the proceeds of the taxes can be used to ensure inclusive growth. But taxes are only one part. There needs to be a broader institutional reforms, which include careful attention to regulatory, tax, and IPR regime. Without those adequate institutional reforms, it will be more difficult for developing countries to catch up. Market power will become greater. Problems of privacy will increase, inequality. Surveillance mechanisms can quickly morph from the private to the public, undermining democracy and basic rights. And there, 5 years ago, a lot of people said, oh, we don't worry about these surveillance technologies because they're in the private sector. It's only Facebook that has them. And I don't think anybody feels that way anymore. And we now realize that information that is in the private sector can easily go into the public. And if the world splits into competing trade areas with differing standards, the developing countries may face difficult choices in choosing sides. And there are already big controversies about what is going on in Africa. The choice is a long-run choice with multiple ramifications. So what I've done so far is to give a broad overview, but when it comes to development, there's a particular, an even more difficult problem, and that is the gainers from these new technologies are located in the advanced countries. And many of the losers, the people whose wages are being depressed by the new technologies are in developing countries. So when I showed that graph and said, well, you could redistribute, those redistributions are across boundaries, across country. And if redistributions within a country are difficult, redistributions across boundaries are even more difficult. So there are what might be called terms of trade effects, which are really very serious and will represent, I think, one of the greatest challenges going forward. There will be some countries that will do reasonably well, because one of the things that the winners, the people in the advanced countries, will use some of their income to demand scarce goods, natural resources in developing countries. And those who have the scarce resources will see their incomes go up. So there'll be a divide between those with and without those sources of rents. But we also know from the natural resource curse that even the countries with the potential of rents may not have inclusive growth. And so things may not work as well. And there's a hidden trap in that some of the benefits of the new technologies, like search engines, may become apparent more quickly than the adverse terms of trade effects that I've just described. And it's inevitable that over the long term, the companies that have control to these technologies will use their market power to redistribute income from developing countries and emerging markets to themselves. We already see the process going on. That is to say, that is inevitable unless the rules change. And the rules change internationally, and unless the developing countries undertake the policies that will countervail. So I want to spend the next few minutes, and I'm running a little bit out of time, but I'll go a few minutes over, talking about some of the policies that I think need to be accompanied the new technologies if they are going to result in inclusive growth in the developing countries. So when we think of new technologies, we think of IPR, and we know that, for instance, TRIPS, the WTO agreement, was an attempt to spread the intellectual property regime of the advanced countries in the United States to the whole world. But I can tell you, because I was in the Clinton administration at the time, that the IPR regime that was in TRIPS was not designed to promote global growth. It wasn't designed to promote the well-being of the developing countries. It was not designed even to promote the well-being in the United States. It was designed to promote the well-being of the pharmaceutical industry and the entertainment industry in the United States. It was a product of special interest legislation. And the point then is that IPR is a social construction. If we don't design it right, it will actually not promote innovation, and it won't promote innovation that will advance the interest of the developing countries. So the bottom line of this is one needs to rethink the rules, including the use of compulsory licenses. The rules affect both the ability of developing countries to catch up and the standards of living in developing countries. And these rules, as I said before, were more about the distribution of income between developing countries and advanced countries than the pace of global innovation. They were designed to give more money to the United States and other advanced countries. So the second issue was taxation. I've already talked about that. But here are a couple of things that we're finally coming to terms with. It's important not to give digital commerce tax preference over non-digital. Doing that really distorts the economy, and it's one of the big advantages that Amazon had. And I think one could argue that it may be desirable to do the reverse. The presence of stores affects the nature of community. A lot of research in recent years has talked about the importance of connectedness and people and how that is being undermined. As I said before, the digital multinationals have excelled in their ability to avoid and evade taxes. It's important to tax them. And that taxation should be viewed as part of a broader program to combat tax avoidance. I don't know how many of you follow the big debates that have been going on and the taxation of the digital economy at the OECD and at the UN. In the Financing for Development meeting in Addis a couple of years ago, there was a big battle between the developing countries and the United States, and the United States won, and made it very clear that they did not want to hear the voice of developing countries. The discussions were put into the OECD, and the proposals now emanating out of the OECD are basically such that restructuring taxation, digital taxation, so the revenues will go to where the goods are consumed, not where the goods are produced. And if that happens, obviously, it would have massive effects on resources available to developing countries. Finally, I think it may be desirable, probably is desirable, to encourage digital national economies. The discussion as I came in talking about learning to learn and learning to do, and having national companies that understand these digital economies is really important. Turning to regulation, as I mentioned before, there's been a major change in perspective on regulation in the last few years, regulation in the area of digital space. A few years ago, there was a lot of optimism that self-regulation will be the basis, rely on the private sector. The private sector understands these new technologies, don't get the government involved. But now I think there's a broad consensus that self-regulation will not work. It hasn't worked in other areas, and hasn't been working in this arena, as we've seen over and over again in the context of Facebook. There actually are several intersecting areas of concern: competition, privacy, security, addiction, manipulation, and there have been multiple attempts, so far inadequate, but moves in the right direction. To me, one of the most interesting things is that California, which is the place where the new technologies originated from, has taken the strongest measures to regulate it. Mm-hmm. It's probably because they understand the risks more than those in the rest of the world. There are restrictions on data aggregation, on storage and use of information, on informed consent on the use of data. One of the reasons this is important is not just privacy, but the new source of market power is data. Data is an important barrier to entry, and there is, as I mentioned in the beginning, a real concern about competition. It's not just that competition is important for ensuring efficient economy. The lack of competition is very closely associated with the growth of inequality. So Europe in this area has led the way with a number of restrictions on what might be called standard conflicts of interest in their actions they've taken against Google. The interesting thing about this is that the political economy competition policy, U.S. should have taken action, but they have more influence in the United States than they have in Europe. And the U.S. has sometimes said, well, Europe is anti-American. It's not anti-American. These are clearly anti-competitive practices, and the competition commissioner stopped them. I think there's a growing consensus the actions have to go further than that. There needs to be a divestiture. There's no reason why Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram ought to be under the same, controlled by the same company. And as I said before, restrictions on the use and sale of information. Let me come finally to trade, and this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, which, unfortunately, the current disputes about the rules-based system coming out of the United States are really distracting the world from what is a serious problem, and that is how we organize trade among countries with very different value system, and where there's a lack of trust. Back in with the fall of the Iron Curtain, there was the hope, as Fukuyama talked about at the end of history, that there'd be convergence and everybody would have the same value system, the whole thing would work nicely. And so we didn't have to debate this issue about trade among countries that didn't trust each other with different value systems. But now there's a lack of confidence that we are converging. And that lack of confidence that we are converging is leading to a whole set of problems. And at the core of it, most dramatically, is a lack of trust in trade in the new digital products. Very hard to verify what is going on. And it's relevant not just to 5G, but to all the products with involved in the Internet of Things, which is an increasing fraction of all products. A kind of question that it raises is, does China's lack of concern about privacy give it an unfair trade advantage in these products? And one could ask the same question, does America's lack of concern give it an unfair trade advantage relative to Europe? This is a problem that we've encountered in other contexts, for instance, with Europe and GMO, but it was seemingly narrow, but now it is on the core products of the new, of the 21st century. And it's not likely that there's going to be full regulatory harmonization, nor should there be. I mean, I don't think we should certainly converge to the privacy standards of China. I hope everybody converges to the privacy standards of California and Europe. But this will almost certainly have consequences for trade in other goods and services, and compounding the tensions that are already there. So let me finally come to the subject, which is inclusion. And inclusion is focused mostly on the opportunities of the new technologies, and I focused here on many of the risks of the new technologies and how they might be mitigated. But then I do want to emphasize the importance of the new opportunities. You've, I'm sure, talked about them, financial inclusion. But just to be somewhat balanced, in many ways, financial inclusion through technologies like being so successful in Kenya have failed to have the broader benefits for development that are associated with other avenues of financial inclusion, such as microcredit in Bangladesh, which has really had very significant effects on the social indicators and has succeeded in inclusion. And it's not a surprise, if you separate finance from other aspects of society, you're going to get a dysfunctional financial system, or not, at least a financial system that doesn't serve society as well as one that is more integrated into the fiber of society. There are other pro-poor benefits that can come from digital technology, the potential to raise smallholder agriculture productivity, health, education, for instance, through MOOC benefits, easier access to international markets, lower barriers to trade, but at the same time, as I mentioned before, there's likely to be greater barriers to the entry of the basic platforms. and an increasing fraction of societal revenues will go to the platforms because of their dominant market power. So this, I say, to come back to the broader issue of inequality, will affect inequality within countries and inequality between countries. The access to knowledge is one of the important aspects of digital the new technologies. That, you know, one of the things we champion, that everybody has access to more knowledge at their fingertips than the biggest libraries 35 years ago. But people are also bombarded by misinformation, and we have to increase the capacities to distinguish between the two and process information. And what we know from what research has occurred is really difficult to do that. The people who've been focusing on disinformation in the media have come away with a sense of depression, that lots of measures have been tried on the demand side of the market, on the supply side of the market, and they help. And some countries have done more successful than others, but they are just, they haven't really gotten, there are no really good solutions at this juncture. So let me finally conclude. This is a time of rapid change in technology and with great uncertainty. There's enormous upside potential of greater inclusion, but this upside potential is matched with a serious downside risks in multiple dimensions. The responses will require oversight and regulation. We know many of the problems that are already unfolding, but there is great uncertainty about the best regulatory response. Although we know one thing, self-regulation will not work. We also know that there will have to be accompanying investments in policies, the kind of thing, as I walked in, you were talking about learning to learn and how to deal lifelong learning, exchanging the nature of education, for instance, and other activities, even perhaps health. There'll have to be these accompanying investments and policies to make sure that developing countries can fully avail themselves of the opportunities that these new technologies afford, and to make sure that development is more inclusive than it's been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know we've reached the time, and as I see, some of you probably have things to do, but we also started a bit late, and I know that some of you would very much welcome the opportunity to engage with Professor Stiglitz and the panel. I know Farid has to leave, so thank you very much for joining us. I don't know, Jael and Elizabeth, I don't know if you have a few more minutes. Okay, great. I think your intervention provided a nice counterpoint to what the discussion had been up to that point. I think it's fair to say that we had focused on the opportunities, and you reminded us about some of the risks associated with the digital economy. But I think what was common across both parts of the conversation is the role that the state needs to play moving forward, both within countries but also international coordination. And I think that came across very clearly in both parts of the discussion. Let me open it up for questions in the spirit of making the best out of the time that we have, which is about 10 minutes, maybe 15 if we really push it. Be brief. So come up to the mic, introduce yourself and ask your question, and we'll take a few and then get back to the panel.
Oh, hi, my name is Ermal Vila, and I had a question for Professor Stiglitz on your thoughts on universal basic income as a way to kind of correct for the loss of jobs, or like lost skilled jobs in automation and kind of the widening inequalities. Thank you.
You want me to answer one by one, or?
Let's just get a few.
Okay.
Hello. My question is also for Professor Stiglitz. You mentioned that digital technology is like a double-edged sword. So in reference to that, when organizations like WFP partner with Palantir, how should we be concerned about such partnerships? And how we as development community ensure that we are not jeopardizing the people we are trying to serve? Thank you.
My name is Albert Zufak. I'm the Chief Economist for Africa. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for your presentation. Two questions. One, what would you advise the World Bank on how to approach the issue of digital taxation? Because we're actually coming at it from different angles, where we do see the benefit of the digital economy actually creating more opportunities and the risk of stifling innovation, and the clear need for our countries to raise revenues to invest in public goods. Second question is the issue of jobs, which is, from my perspective, the key aspect of inclusion. You did mention in your presentation that the East Asian model may be obsolete, but I've just came back from Ethiopia, a country you know very well, and I just visited Hawassa, a city where in the past 3 years, industrial parks have been, built and created more than 20,000 jobs in 3 years in the areas of garments and textile. And these products are actually being sold on the US market, but also increasingly in Asia. What would you tell Prime Minister Abiy tomorrow about a job strategy and the way the digital should play? Thank you.
We'll take one more, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sumit Kaur. Very interesting, broad discussion. I wanted to get specific also about jobs, actually. I'll mention two things. So I want to hear reflections about the gig economy. Digitization is obviously taking us more in that direction. Most young people are not going to know the type of jobs that we all here in this room experience. Secondly, there's a lot of tension between borders and, a worldview, sort of an analog worldview, if you will, and then, borderless digital world. Again, reflecting that upon jobs, so you have, commercialization, consumerism, data, technology that are so cross-border, they can move freely, but labor markets still really cannot move as freely. So just want to hear a little bit more granularity about your reflections about jobs. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So several of the questions were about jobs. Let me begin. My main criticism of UBI is that most people want not just a handout, but the dignity of work. And UBI actually removes the pressure on governments to create jobs for anybody who's willing to work. So I don't think, some of my younger friends say, well, I'm very old-fashioned, that they can lead a spiritual life without work very happily, and that I have certain obsessions with work, but I still think for most people work is important, and UBI is not the answer. The second thing is that the ability to raise revenue to finance UBI is not going to be there, and that given the scarcity of revenue, it's much more important to target the revenue to areas that would promote development inclusion. And so giving a grant to everybody, whether they need it or not, is not, in my mind, the best use of scarce resources. The issue of revenues, it was raised by the question about digital taxation. When it comes to companies like Google and Facebook coming into a developing country, most of the revenue they're getting there is pure rent. They're selling advertising, and the overall cost of the platform has already been paid. So my view is the developing countries should tax it at a very high rate. their income is almost pure rent. They're not going to leave. You have to figure out what is the maximum revenue tax rate you can get without them leaving, because they are adding something. So I think they should face very high taxation. And I said it certainly doesn't make any sense to let them escape taxation, which puts domestic retail, for instance, or wholesale, at a disadvantage. So I think you just have to remember that they've already paid the fixed cost, and it's all at this point about rent seeking on their part. The hardest question, I do think the export-led growth, manufacturing export-led growth model is almost surely over. By that I mean the following. If all the jobs in manufacturing that were in China moved to Africa, it would still not make a big dent in providing jobs for the new entrants into the labor force. Already manufacturing employment in China is on the decrease. So it's great that Ethiopia is getting those jobs quickly, and it will help Ethiopia's growth. But it can't be a model that will be used all over Africa. And how long it'll be able to be used in Ethiopia is also up for grabs. So what does that mean? One has to deconstruct why it was that export-led growth manufacturing export-led growth was so successful. And it did several things all at the same time. It created employment, it generated foreign exchange, it gave access, made people think about technology, learning. So it helped transform the economy from into a more modern economy. It helped develop institutions like education institutions and financial institutions. So it did a lot of different things. I think development is going to have to do all those things, but it won't come all in manufacturing. You'll need to support agriculture for creating jobs. You'll have to support a service sector also for creating jobs. And so there'll be have to be a much more balanced structure to the development strategy, what I call a multi-pronged approach. The gig economy does present some real challenges, I think, going forward, partly because workers are spread out and have no bargaining power. And we've seen that very clearly in the case of Uber and Lyft and the other, where if you look at the wages received by drivers today per hour that they're on, they're substantially below America's minimum wage. And America's minimum wage is pathetic. I mean, it's $7.25 an hour. And outrageous, New York City has tried to address this issue and raise the minimum wage. And guess what? Lyft and Juno and the other companies are suing New York because they don't want to have an effective minimum wage. Now, one of the great things about some of these things like Lyft is that the technology that makes them so consumer valuable also allows you to monitor them and to calculate what the minimum wage is. And so we know what they're getting per hour that they're on working on the platform. And so we can regulate them and we can make sure that they do get paid a minimum wage. Well, what that highlights is two things. One, I think there's going to be a different set of government regulations needed for the gig economy. It is different. And there's going to be different sets of labor organization the way unions were organized around a steel mill is very different the way they're organized around the gig economy. But there are some successes in organizing around the gig economy. So I think that's part of what needs to be done. Given the limited time, just let me ask one final question, and that has to do with the nature of the borderless economy that the digital economy has opened up. And it highlights the fact that, we've had globalization, but it's been a very asymmetric globalization. Some things move more easily across borders. As you pointed out, capital, electrons move more easily across borders, but labor doesn't move that easily across borders. And the second important thing is that it is still the case that the nation state is responsible for the welfare of individuals and is the unit of you might say, of political action. So we have this globalized world, which is, if we don't restructure it, undermining the ability of the nation state to perform its functions. I talked about the difficulty of raising taxes. If these multinational digital don't pay taxes and more of the revenue goes onto the platforms, there won't be the revenues that are necessary for a state to function and for the activities we all talk about of inclusion, education, and health, which are necessary. There won't be that kind of revenue. So that's why, we obviously need better international rules. But even within the existing international rules, countries have to really take a hold of what they can do, and I think they can do a lot more, like on digital taxation, to recover some of their capacities that have been eroded in the last 10, 15 years.
Thank you. Jayla and Elizabeth, I'd like to give you an opportunity if you want to add anything on any of those things or reflect on what we heard from Professor Stiglitz since we flipped everything around. Otherwise, we'll close, but I did want to give you that opportunity.
Not much really, just that I think there is a choice, there's a public policy choice. How effective that will be depends on, I think, many factors, including much of the issues we discuss now are present because of vested interests and because of the political economy considerations. Developing economies don't have inclusive development as a policy choice, as an objective. And I don't think digital will necessarily get us there unless we find a clever way of shaming and naming. I don't know how else we'll get there, given what we have.
Well, I said before, I think that Professor Stiglitz, to me, is the macroeconomic Mick Jagger. And I'm not an economist, I'm a poverty specialist and a lawyer. So I probably wouldn't even be Keith Richards or Charlie Watts or anything in this, so I wouldn't want to opine on this specifically, except to say that I think they're huge. I re-emphasize the fact that it is up to governments and multinationals and international organizations to take this bull by the horns, and the time is far past in which we actually have to think aggressively and strategically about how we start taxing the benefits of people who become wildly rich, richer than ever in history, and think about really how we redistribute or make possible the redistributive policies and impact of this revolution that we're living through. And we do have choices to make, but they are absolutely ones that have to be made in the public policy arena, and they're ethical ones that we have to make as a human society.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you, and I hope that everybody walks out of here thinking about what those choices that I think you alluded to at the end are and how they are meaningful for your jobs. For those of you in the poverty practice, lunch will be served in the area across the hall. But before we all leave, please join me in thanking the panelists and Professor Stiglitz.